Hello everyone, my name is Rui Ferreira and I'm a PhD candidate in architecture at the School of Architecture, Art and Design of the University of Minho and a researcher in Lab 2PT and Arc2U Technologies Modular System project supported by PRR and Next Generation European funds. In this presentation, I will talk about the proposal of my PhD called Regenerating Habitats, a new housing based on modular wooden systems. I'd like to start precisely with the first sentence of the title, Regenerating the Habitat. The natural conformity of human beings in relation to the built environment and their own habitat is a complex issue that reflects a constant conflict between the need for stability and the search for evolution. From the beginning of civilization, human beings have always shown an intrinsic desire to transform their surroundings, driven by a need to improve their living conditions and adapt the environment to their needs. A close example of this is the simple act of moving furniture around, something that not only me but many people practice intuitively and even compulsively. This is perhaps the most effective way of making visible a criticism about the space we live in. Changing the layout of the furniture is the most accessible and quickest way we have to transform the home we live in. Changing the disposition of furniture also changes the way we use our home. The truth is that human beings have always had this desire to change, this need to constant modification of their built environment in the search for better comfort and living conditions. Defining the beginning of a flexible architecture, an architecture that responds to this variability, proves to be a very difficult task. If we just think about the dwellings of nomadic peoples, like the Mongolian yurts, who, in addition to the materiality and spatial layout adapted to the climate and lifestyle of the community, were made up of a structure designed to be assembled and disassembled quickly, allowing the inhabitants to move easily between different locations in search of their subsistence. In this sense, trying to explain the history of flexible housing is at the same time trying to explain the history of housing itself. So, the field of our analysis is limited to the 20th and 21st centuries. On one hand, because this is a period in which there is a great focus on housing issues as a result of the different circumstances that took place through the century, like the world wars, but also because it's here that the first intentions of the part of the architects to design intentionally adaptable buildings began. Based on the book Flexible Housing, we can, in a very summarized way, divide the evolution of this issue over the last century in 4 episodes. In the first decades of the century, coinciding with the beginning of modernism and the debate of housing, the first ideologies and experiments in flexibility appeared. We have some examples like Le Corbusier, Gary Ritwell and the paradigmatic Schroeder house, and Richard Neutra. In the mid-century, with advances in industrialization, a link between flexibility and prefabricated buildings emerged with the development of a number of industrially systemized solutions and components. Names like Walter Gropius, Jean Prouvé, or Charles and Ray Eames were part of the experimentalist generation. Lately, the development of collectible housing and social participation has led to a renewed interest in flexible housing as a way of giving voice to the users. The open building concepts introduced by John O'Braken brought a different perspective on building structures that influenced a generation of architects to propose new models of living. At the end of the century, with the start of the first ideas of sustainability and the circular economy, an idea of constructive flexibility appeared. An example of this is the decomposition of a building construction into different layers to facilitate its maintenance or transformation, the concept of sharing layers introduced by Stuart Brand. So, when it hits the 21st century, there is a 5th episode which clearly reflects an evolutionary logic observed through the previous century. On one side, the experimentation of modernism and collectible housing influences the new housing models, such as co-housing, with a horizon in response to urban, economic and social challenges. On the other side, there is an evolution of technology providing the development of production and manufacturing systems and methods that favor the flexibility of buildings. Principles such as design for disassembly, design for adaptability, material passport, standardization, or modularity are some of the topics identified as the main drivers of flexibility in construction today. Just as architecture and the flexibilities of space have followed the changes and needs of society over the last decades, it's now our goal to understand today's society in order to know which logics will best adapt to their needs. Today, we are surrounded by uncertainty. We live increasingly faster without space, without time. From a social point of view, with the constant growth of population, daily migrations of different scales and contexts, cultural demands or personal preferences, or from an economic point of view, with the unpredictable variations of market values, or even the undeniable climate emergency. The quest for global sustainability and technical demands requires a change in our building design culture in order to adopt a new vision in which buildings are flexible to deal with different variables through their useful life. In this evolutionary logic, the main goal of this research is to propose an episode 6 scenario that could be an alternative to the current housing models. In this sense, combining A, the new needs and ways of living, with B, the latest constructive development, seems to be the logical solution. If housing, in a specific context, has historically and culturally been associated with a certain model of cohabitation or a package of housing functions, 21st century housing is characterized by uncertainty in relation to functional needs and groups of domestic cohabitation relationships. This is reflected in the demographic changes that have taken place over the last 20 years, including examples like a decrease in number of families considered traditional, an increase in the number of single-person households, a higher proportion of elderly people, a greater demand for shared accommodation, or a growing tendency to work from home. Polish-British sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, a post-Marxist analyst of modernity, describes today's society as liquid. With this adjective, he refers to an entity whose evolving nature limits its knowledge, because by the time we have finished analyzing it, it already changed. The speed of social processes in the contemporary world, such as globalization, make it a liquid world. In this sense, static and rigid buildings are not an option for the needs of today's society. The construction industry is responsible for a significant amount of resource consumption globally, accounting for more than 50% of global energy use and more than 35% of CO2 emissions. The most popular construction materials, like steel or concrete, are major pollutants that contribute greatly to the carbon footprint of the construction industry. So there is a great demand for a new versatile construction material that can match the resistance and strength. The use of wood, under responsible forestry conditions, being a natural carbon sink, could allow the construction sector to avoid the substantial greenhouse gas emissions associated with the unsustainable use of materials. In addition, wooden elements could also continue to store CO2 for the lifetime of the building. However, a change in the raw material is not enough given that much of the pollution caused by construction is related to the tons of construction and demolition waste generated by premature and arbitrary demolition practices. This predominant end-of-life option for building and their components is a result of a linear production model used by most of construction companies. New building concepts should be promoted in the future that can be redesigned, upgraded or disassembled without generating waste. Prefabrication and modularity were important in the history of architecture for understanding these methods of implementing and improving them, simplifying the process of disassembling at the end of the building's life cycle. So the combination of these two issues once again proves to be complementary. On one hand, adapting the living conditions of spaces to today's society will allow us to extend the useful life of a building, delaying what could be its earlier demolition. On the other hand, by taking advantage of the technical adaptability that prefabricated and modular solutions, especially using wood, allow, it will be possible to create different spatial solutions from conventional models. In other words, the aim is to introduce flexible spatial logics in the principles of modular construction, which are often associated with more rigid and compartmentalized programs, and introduce the constructive logics of disassembly and malleability of modular construction components into conventional linear models often used in residential construction. With this, we are not promoting a miracle solution that aims to solve all the problems of construction, specifically in the housing sector, but instead to develop an alternative solution among several possible ones. In order to limit our scope of analysis, we will focus on the Portuguese context. Despite the fact that the timber construction had an important tradition in Portugal until the 20th century, it was fundamentally based on mixed construction processes and was rarely used as an integral solution. Today, despite being a sector characterized by the development of micro-enterprises, recent development shows signs of growth, and a considerable increase in supply and marketing is expected in the coming years, which reveals the relevance and need for research in the same direction. In order to complement the existing information about the wood production and marketing industry in Portugal, one of the first goals of the research was to develop a questionnaire addressed to the companies with the aim of analyze and identify how the industrialization of modular wood systems could be an alternative to the actual challenges and needs of housing in Portugal. Some of the questions we intend to answer are the main systems and types of wood used, origin of these woods, current applications, scale of operation, barriers, among others. Despite the fact that we don't have concrete data, given that the quiz is still open, based on other similar studies that have already been carried out, it's possible to anticipate the ability to develop this sector in Portugal, although there are some barriers. These include the lack of knowledge and experience in modular construction, the need to implement public training courses, and the integration of research institutions in the development of proposals. On this last point, there are some projects underway at the moment, such as R2U Technologies Modular System, of which I am a member, a cluster specializing in prefabrication and modular construction that will stand out as a national response, positioning Portugal as a globally prominent supplier in this new approach to the construction industry. Another common denominator cited by the main companies is the need for government intervention and the promotion of these methods in public projects. Understanding the capacity of companies in the sector to develop new solutions, it is therefore necessary to understand what type of housing is currently being designed in Portugal. With the last 2 points in mind, and considering the different housing measures promoted by the Portuguese government in recent years, public housing seems to be the appropriate case study. Given that this type of housing usually responds to a variety of different resident profiles and their changes over time, its analysis will allow us to understand if the principles of flexibility will be able to respond to demographic changes and emerging needs of the population. Social housing is often at the center of urban planning policies, so analyzing this sector will make possible analyze how these measures are being incorporated with flexibility principles. Social housing has a solid foundation in Portugal, from the workers' quarters at the beginning of the 20th century to urban rehabilitation projects of today. Over the century, there has always been room for experimentation, proving to be a testing ground for new architectural and urban planning practices. It is necessary to ensure that flexible housing solutions are being implemented in an equitable manner, ensuring that everyone, whatever their socio-economic condition, will have access to housing that is adaptable to their needs. Like said before, this specific case study reveals more pertinence considering that the main public entities responsible for housing sector in Portugal, such as IRU and SERU, as well as a number of municipalities, have promoted several design competitions over the last few years with the aim of responding to the housing problem. So the main goal is to analyze the standard typology promoted by these entities as well as identify a transversal pattern between the selected proposals. We start from a base of around 40 proposals and only the first placed one is analyzed. Considering that these are competitions with a construction commitment, this means analyzing the one that will actually be built. Specific attention is paid to typological, spatial, and constructive issues based on the available elements in order to categorize the types of action. To show an example, we select one project, Partes Picotos in Matosinhos, promoted by IRU, with the result announced in January of the present year. The spatial analysis is based on diagrams that make possible understand not only the distribution of spaces, but also their interrelationships. In this specific case, and indeed in most cases, we can see that there is a clear division between night and day spaces, with the connecting link being the entrance hall or the circulation. Observing the jury report, we can see that this type of spatial layout is almost always a requirement in the preliminary program. There is also an analysis of the proposal capacity for spatial flexibility and adaptability according to the categories in the book Flexible Housing. Also, the project's construction profiles and descriptions are analyzed in order to understand its characteristics. Despite the fact that this study is still in development phase, some conclusions can already be drawn. It remains a model based on conventional spatial matrices based on rigid compartmentation, built on an ideology taken over from the traditional family of the 20th century. There's still a division between daytime and nighttime activities, creating spaces that are intentionally disconnected from each other, with the main connecting element being an uncharacteristic space, in most cases a corridor with no possibility for any kind of occupation. In terms of spatial flexibility, only around 20% of the proposals have some kind of flexibility, and in most of which are sliding or folding panels that separate the kitchen from the living room. In terms of construction, it can be seen that linear solutions based on structural resources like concrete or brick remain. Despite this, there are some signs of a paradigm shift with the recurrent introduction of prefabricated facade systems or the appearance of modular bedroom solutions in some cases, which shows a likeness of part of competitors to bet on solutions that allow for greater savings in resources and faster implementation on site. There are also no solutions using wood or other natural materials, which demonstrates the need to explore the subject. If we look to countries like Finland, Switzerland, or more recently France, we can easily identify measurements that have promoted and even required the use of natural materials such as wood. Since 2022, all public buildings financed by French state must be built with at least 50% of wood or another natural material. In the image, taking advantage of the proximity of the project to the Congress Place, we see on the left the use of wood in a social housing building designed by architect Parish Toral near Barcelona, and even closer the student residence by Atelier Architects built with modular volumes located on the neighbor of the Congress site. It is essential to understand the reasons why these measures have gone backward in Portugal. We often associate the difficulty of implementing new measures and new systems with the change that this implies in the conventional models, where an entire sector is already oriented in a certain direction. However, the following image shows a social housing complex built in Portugal around 100 years ago with wood as a main construction system called the mountable houses. Of course, here in a completely different context with another type of framework. So this is a work in progress, so the next goals of research will be understand which of the building systems commonly used in timber structures is best suited to the current state of the industry in Portugal. For that, it will be necessary to get feedback from the companies in the form mentioned earlier. After that, it will be necessary to define a basis. This basis will result from interpreting the most common metric used in the analyzing of the competitions, because despite the fact that this is a new proposal, it must be based on existing models in order to be applicable in the current reality. On this basis, it will be necessary to understand how the system, its components and connections can respond to the different types of flexibility imposed by the living models of today's society. Talking about connections, just like Gropius, Bachmann and many other figures through the history have tried solutions that, for many reasons, have not been as successful as they hoped, maybe now it's the time to try a new approach. With technological advances and the increasing need for sustainable and adaptable housing solutions, modular timber construction has emerged as a promising opportunity. Through this research, we aim not only to explore the potential of this technique, but also to inspire transformation in the way we design and live our spaces, creating a flexible, sustainable, and innovative architecture. Thank you.